everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. The 2024 presidential election is tomorrow, November 5th. And joining us now is Skye Perryman. She's the president and CEO of Democracy Forward, and she has been doing a lot of work around election integrity and the courts. Skye, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, of course, tomorrow is the general election. It's election day, but people have been early voting for the last 2 to 3 weeks in some states. And we have north of 70 million early votes that have been cast. What do you make generally of the early voting enthusiasm and what it says about people's participation in American democracy?
Well, I think it's encouraging to see so many early votes and people that are really tuning in and paying attention to what is at stake this year. We don't know all the demographics yet. I think of all the early voting, there's been some early analyses out, but we definitely are seeing that women and young people are turning out, and it will be really interesting to see how this election compares to others, given the propensity of the early vote.
According to the University of Florida's election lab, we can say right now that 54% of the early vote, which actually I should have said was closer to 80 million, it's roughly 78 million early votes have been cast. So 54% of that have been from female voters and 43.6% have been from male voters. Skye, what do you make of the enthusiasm and early voting that we've seen among women?
Well, look, this is the first presidential election since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. Women across the country are being deprived of health care, and I think people are really understanding the stakes, which is why you see that enthusiasm among women turning out early and voting. And we also see enthusiasm among young people who have a lot at stake as well.
Those early voting totals are closer to 8%. So I'm curious to see how many 18 to 25-year-olds turn out tomorrow. Now, when we talk about voter turnout and elections in the United States, ever since the 2020 election, certain actors have been sowing doubt in the integrity of our elections. And I know you've been doing a lot of work with Democracy Forward to assure the public of the safety and security and integrity of our elections. Can you talk about what questions you're getting right now from the American public about how accurate and safe and reliable our election will be tomorrow?
Well, we certainly know that there are actors that are seeking to sow misinformation and confusion. But what's important to remember is that in this country, voting is sacred and every vote counts, and we're going to ensure that every vote is counted. There have been studies for some time over a course of years. There has never been increased instances or large instances of voter fraud in the United States. There is not a concern around election integrity in the United States, and it's important that we call those types of allegations what they are, which is misinformation seeking to undermine people's participation in the electoral process, and that everyone exercise their right to vote. The federal government has taken a number of steps to ensure the safety and security of our elections, and we really want to encourage everyone to continue to exercise their rights as Americans to make their voices heard.
I just want to underline something you just said. So over the course of history, you said there's never been documented voter fraud. Is that correct?
Certainly over the course of the last few decades. And then when you look at the last few years where you've had certain actors seeking to sow doubt in our election process, there have not been demonstrated instances of widespread voter fraud. In 2017, when former President Trump sought to make a case for voter fraud because he was upset at that point that he had lost the popular vote, even though he had won the Electoral College, he set up a commission known as the Pence-Kobach Voter Commission. It was an unlawful commission, and they had to disband that commission halfway through it in the face of litigation pressure in 2017. But guess what? Even that commission found no demonstrated instances of voter fraud, because this is not actually something that we have to be concerned about in 2024 or in 2027 or in 2020 in American life. What we do need to be concerned about are increased instances of misinformation and people trying to prohibit the American people or deter the American people from making their voice heard in a critical election year.
What might that look like tomorrow on election day in terms of people, bad actors, deterring people from voting or otherwise trying to interfere? And part two of that question is, what should someone do if they are at a polling place and they see an act of voter intimidation or misinformation?
There are resources. You can go to democracyforward.org and find resources where if you have a concern on election day, you can reach out to the voter protection hotlines that are available and resources that are available throughout the country to help you make your voice heard. What we do expect that we may see is the former president seeking to potentially declare victory early or try to make some moves before votes are counted. It's important that the American people know that in this year, we think it is unlikely that the final results are going to be known on election night, particularly in very large counties throughout the country. Votes have to be counted, and it takes a while to count those votes, particularly when the polls are open until the evening. And so we want to make sure that people are patient, that we are all following our duties as Americans to make our voices heard through voting and then to wait for those votes to be counted.
I was just about to ask because we spoke with Michael McDonald at the University of Florida's election lab, and he broke down the state by state rules and regulations on how they count votes. Of course, every state kind of has its own process. So, what happens in Florida is not necessarily what is going to happen in Pennsylvania, which accounts for some of those differences. But, Skye, when do you think we might know the final result of this election?
I'm not going to predict that. But what I do know is that we may not, and we should be ready that we may not know and likely aren't to know on election night. And while votes are being counted and while processes are being followed throughout the country, we do know that there will be a concerted effort on the part of far right actors to wheel and deal in misinformation and disinformation around the election. It's important that we reject that we stay calm, keep calm, let the votes be counted, and see how the American people are choosing their future in this election.
Now, other pollsters and political science experts have talked about a potential red or blue mirage based on how the early vote counting comes in. And for more than one election cycle in modern history has the winner of the popular vote not ultimately obtained the presidency. And so I want to ask you, should there be a similar scenario this cycle where one candidate wins the popular vote, but the other wins the electoral college and then becomes president? How do you think that will shape American feelings and belief in democracy and the strength of our election?
Well, I think that there are really major concerns long term around ensuring that everyone is represented. And we know that the Electoral College has created a situation in modern election history where millions of Americans that have voted for the person that got the popular vote did not ultimately get to select who was in the White House. However, what we know is that people are showing up, that people are energized across the country in this election. They see and they know what's at stake. And so we'll have to see how the votes come in and how they're counted. But we do have work over the long term to do to continue to protect and fortify democracy and to continue to protect and fortify the American people's voices. We simply cannot be one election cycle away every cycle from the types of threats that we're seeing from far-right actors that are wheeling and dealing in misinformation, that are trying to intimidate people, that are saying that if they're elected, they want to persecute their enemies or the press. That is not America. And there's a lot of work to do after this cycle to ensure that we're continuing to strengthen our democratic institutions in this country to work for the American people in 2024, in 2025, and beyond.
So, Skye, earlier in this conversation, you mentioned that a recent Supreme Court decision, the one that overturned Roe v. Wade, has been a motivating factor in a lot of voters' participation in early voting so far. So speaking of the highest court in the land, I'm curious, how could the 2024 election affect the future of the Supreme Court?
This is a significant election for the future of the Supreme Court. It is quite possible that whoever is elected will have the ability to nominate and confirm judges, but it's more significant actually because of what we know about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court right now, the American people have a very low favorability rating. They do not view the court widely as legitimate as a result of a number of ethical lapses and as a result of the fact that the court has overturned people's rights as opposed to protecting it. And so the next president will also have the opportunity to reform the Supreme Court and put in place or propose reforms and put in place important reforms for people and communities. You've already seen President Biden call for that. Vice President Harris called for that throughout her campaign. And so this is a very significant election for the future of the courts, not just with respect to who will be nominated and confirmed. And that's very important. We know that. We know that Roe v. Wade was overturned because of the nominations and confirmations that Donald Trump made in the last election, which is what is so motivating people. But it's very important kind of who is on the court, but also what we are going to do in this country to restore legitimacy to the institution of the Supreme Court when so many Americans have lost confidence in that institution. It is not good for democracy, and it is not good for people and communities, for the American people to not have confidence in their courts. And so I think the next president, and particularly if it's Vice President Harris, will have a real opportunity to make some of those changes that are incredibly important. The other thing I would point out for the courts is it's not just the Supreme Court. Remember that our court system in the United States has federal courts across the country that the president is able to nominate and the Senate confirms. President Biden has confirmed a number of judges that are professionally and demographically diverse, that reflect the American people and that have done the work of the American people. And it's important because those judges, you and I have talked about this on various other interviews about mifepristone or a lot of these issues that arise with lower court judges. And so that's an important thing to watch as well. And this next president will have a major role with those confirmations.
It's really a multi-pronged approach. If President Biden appointed some 200 judges on lower courts, the next president, could they appoint just as many? Do you think? Is that realistic?
So it's a function of how many vacancies there are. And both President Trump and President Biden appointed and confirmed quite a number of judges. But there are many things that we need to be thinking about in our country. Our lower courts are overworked. And there have been calls for expansions of the number of judges in the lower court system so that the American people can have their cases heard in a more efficient way. And so that is one area that the Senate and that we hope a future president will look at with respect to the courts. And then, of course, there are the nominations. There will be retirements and there are a number of vacancies. There'll be important vacancies to be filled, even with Congress's last few weeks of its term this year, that a number of organizations will be focused. Democracy Forward, Demand Justice, and so many others will be focused on encouraging those confirmations.
Now, I know Democracy Forward has also come out with its projections for what would happen if Donald Trump wins and institutes Project 2025 in his first 100 days in office. There are a lot of policy proposals in Project 2025, but what is the most important thing you want the Forbes audience to know about what those first 100 days could look like under a potential second administration from President Trump?
Project 2025 is devastating and would aim to take away from the American people many of the things that we deserve, that we enjoy, and that we have rights to as the American people. What we will want to be looking at in those first 100 days, of course, if Donald Trump assumes office, is we would expect him to take a number of very lawless, rash actions to implement some of the more egregious portions of Project 2025, whether that is undermining our voter integrity system in the country, whether it is reclassifying our civil servants and trying to politicize them, whether it is reversing certain progress that we've made on labor rights, on overtime eligibility, and on healthcare access under the Biden administration. The thing to make sure that we know is that many of the things that they are proposing should be unlawful and that there will be a community that would be there to challenge it. But we don't want to be in that place. The stakes are really so high this election year for everything that people and communities care about in their daily lives, but also in our broader national community. It's all on the line.
I'm going to have to let you go soon, but for my final few questions, I'm going to put on my Forbes Women editor hat, and I'm going to ask you to put on your regular Skye hat and take off your Democracy Forward CEO hat, because there has been a lot of coverage about the gender divide in this election and how women are breaking for Vice President Kamala Harris by double-digit margins. NBC News came out with a poll today that had the net margin at 34 points between men and women, and how women are breaking for Harris, men are breaking for Trump. Skye, do you think women have the power to push Vice President Harris into the presidency?
I do. I think we're seeing that. But I also think that we're seeing a lot of concerning efforts to try to undermine women's voices and to try to undermine the voices of people in community that care about the rights of all people. So the stakes are very high and the threats are incredibly real. But I think you see a lot of energy out there. We saw this with the midterms where people were predicting, they were predicting a red wave, and we saw women and communities stand up for themselves and for their futures. And so I predict that's what we're going to be seeing here.
And of course, there was the Iowa poll that came out over the weekend, which showed among women over the age of 50, a huge, huge swing in support for Vice President Kamala Harris. How much do you think Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision is weighing on voters' minds?
I think it's a top issue. And at places like Iowa, where there have been severe restrictions on abortion care access, where people in their own communities know people or have experienced themselves or in their family, folks that are going without the health care that they need in the most vulnerable and intimate times in their lives. This is unacceptable. This is not where the United States should be in 2024. And I think you see women saying that loud and clear. And our hope is that others join along with them and that we can make some real changes in this election to help the American people move forward and to really chart a course where everyone's rights are protected.
What's been interesting about this election cycle is that I have found that it's more regular people talking about the gender of the two candidates than at least one of the candidates herself. Vice President Kamala Harris, when accepting her party's nomination for president, didn't actually use the word first in reference to herself. I did a search of the transcript. The only time the word first appeared in her DNC speech was in reference to a bill she had spearheaded as California Attorney General. But some of the women I talked to say it means a lot to them to have a potential first female president. What does that historic first potentially mean to you, if anything, or is your focus more on the policies?
I think that of course it is past time that the United States be led by a female executive, but really this is about policies and issues and who is going to secure the future of the American people. The vice president has said that she will be a president for all people, including those that may not agree with her on all of those issues, on every single issue, but that she is about fortifying our democracy, and protecting the future of our country for all Americans, including those that may not be traditionally Democratic voters. I think that garners a lot of respect from a vast majority of the American people. And I hope that we will see that borne out on Tuesday.
Skye Perryman, thank you so much for joining us. As always, we so appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you.